The atmosphere inside the Karelia mining outpost was thick with the smell of recycled oxygen and industrial grease. Outside, the sub-zero winds of the moon howled against the reinforced titanium hull, a constant, low-frequency vibration that most residents had long since learned to ignore. Vaxen Kahl was not most residents. His ears, sharpened by a decade of combat in the Fringe Wars, picked up every mechanical sigh and hydraulic hiss of the station. He was currently midway through a brutal rehabilitation session, his bare torso, mapped with a jagged geography of thermal burn scars and shrapnel exits, glistened with sweat. He gripped the cold steel of a gravity weight bar, pushing 50 kilograms against the moon's artificial light gravity setting. His muscles, corded like braided carbon fiber cables, bunched and strained with every repetition. For Vaxen, the pain was the only thing that felt real anymore. It was a reminder that he had survived when better men had turned into stardust. A sudden, heavy thud resonated through the floor of his cramped, single-unit prefab. It wasn't the rhythmic thumping of the mining drills. It was the sound of a heavy landing, something large being dropped right at his doorstep. Vaxen dropped the weights. They hit the padded floor with a dull metallic clang. In one fluid motion, he reached for the pulse pistol hidden under his workbench, his fingers locking onto the grip with practiced ease. He didn't have many friends on Karelia, and the ones he did have didn't drop by without a comm ping first. "Identify yourself!" Vaxen barked at the door, his voice like gravel grinding in a gearbox. The door's external sensors chirped. A synthesized, emotionless voice drifted through the intercom. "Delivery for Citizen Kahl Vaxen. Registered ID 79 Delta Echo. Shipment originates from the Void Chamber Syndicate. Courier standing by for biometric confirmation." Vaxen frowned. The Syndicate? He hadn't touched a contract for those vultures in over 3 years. He stepped to the door, peering through the reinforced slit view. Outside stood a spindly, 3-armed automaton, clad in the charcoal gray livery of a high-end courier service. Behind it sat a massive, matte black shipping container, nearly 2 meters tall and etched with glowing violet runes. Vaxen cycled the airlock. The door slid open with a sharp hiss of pressure equalization. The cold air of the hallway, smelling of ozone and frost, rushed in. "Sign here, citizen," the droid droned, extending a haptic pad. Vaxen didn't move. "I didn't order anything, especially not something that looks like a tactical coffin from the Void Chamber." "Sender, Archprelate Thraxis," the droid replied. "Priority, blood debt grade. Sign or the unit will be returned, and your refusal will be logged as a breach of the Accord of Gratitude." Vaxen felt a cold spike of memory hit him. Nebula Station. 5 years ago. The air had been filled with the screams of dying diplomats and the roar of plasma fires. He had dragged a portly, terrified alien with violet skin and gold-threaded robes through a corridor of collapsing bulkheads. Thraxis. The man had promised him a debt that would span the stars. Vaxen had dismissed it as the frantic babbling of a survivor. "Fine," Vaxen muttered, scrawling his signature on the pad. "But tell your boss that next time, a crate of high-grade bourbon would suffice." The droid didn't respond. It simply turned on its hydraulic heels and marched back toward the lift, leaving the massive container sitting in the middle of Vaxen's entryway. The door slid shut, and silence reclaimed the room. Vaxen circled the crate. It wasn't just metal. It was a sophisticated piece of engineering. Cooling vents at the base hummed softly, emitting a faint mist of nitrogen. The violet runes weren't just decorative. "Holan Hungkam Biendeo Doisu Onjin Sin Hak." "What the hell are you playing at, Thraxis?" he whispered. He pressed his thumb against the central locking mechanism. The runes turned from violet to a soft, inviting blue. With a series of rhythmic, mechanical clicks, the front panel split into 4 sections, folding back like the petals of a metallic flower. A wave of chilled, sweet-smelling vapor spilled out, obscuring the interior for a moment. As the mist cleared, Vaxen's heart did something it hadn't done in years. It skipped a beat. Nestled inside a bed of translucent gel foam was a woman. No, not a woman, a Catharian. Vaxen had seen them in data slates, mostly in reports about illegal trafficking and high-end black market auctions. They were rare, beautiful, and according to the stories, almost mythical in their grace. Her skin was a pale, luminous mint green, shimmering with a faint, natural bioluminescence that seemed to pulse in time with a slow, sleeping heartbeat. Her hair, the color of a deep-sea reef, was long and silky, fanning out around her shoulders like a halo. She wore a minimalist suit of silver webbing that seemed more like a second skin than a garment, leaving much of her slender, toned form exposed to the cool air. A holographic projector at the base of the crate flickered to life. The shimmering image of Archprelate Thraxus appeared. He looked older than Vaxen remembered, his lavender jowls sagging under the weight of his ornate robes. "Greetings, Commander Kahl," the hologram said, its voice warm but tinged with a formal distance. "If you are seeing this, then my most precious token of gratitude has reached you. You saved my life when the universe sought to end it. On my world, we do not pay in coin. We pay in life." Vaxen narrowed his eyes. "You sent me a person, you old lizard?" "This is Lyra," the hologram continued, oblivious to Vaxen's remark. "She is a Cytherian of the first house. She has been trained in every art known to our civilization: companionship, linguistics, and the deep sync bond. She is yours, Vaxen, a companion for your solitude, a light for your darkness. Speak the activation sequence. Arise, the dawn is constant, to wake her. May she serve you as faithfully as you served me." The hologram vanished, leaving only the soft hum of the life support system. Vaxen stared at the girl. He felt a surge of anger, a familiar hot sensation in his chest. He hated the Syndicate. He hated their casual ownership of living things. He was a soldier, not a slave master. "I ought to just haul you back to the spaceport," he grumbled, though his eyes lingered on her face. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal, with high cheekbones and a mouth that looked like it had never known a harsh word. He looked around his tiny, cluttered apartment, a half-eaten protein bar, a stack of weapon maintenance manuals, and a view of a frozen wasteland. He was a loner by choice, a man who preferred the company of machines because machines didn't have feelings you could hurt, but he couldn't just leave her in a box. The nitrogen levels were dropping. The stasis field was already beginning to degrade. Vaxen took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he reached out to touch the edge of the crate. "This is a bad idea, a real foobar situation." He cleared his throat, his voice sounding foreign in the quiet room. "Arise. The dawn is constant." The effect was instantaneous. The blue runes on the crate flared into a brilliant, blinding white. The gel foam bed began to liquefy, draining away through hidden grates at the base. Inside the Cytherian girl's chest, a soft glow ignited, radiating outward until her entire body was bathed in a gentle, pulsing emerald light. Her eyes snapped open. They weren't like human eyes. There were no pupils, only swirling pools of liquid gold flecked with amber sparks. She didn't gasp or struggle. She simply rose from the crate with a fluid, terrifyingly graceful motion, as if gravity were merely a suggestion she chose to follow. She stood before Vaxen, her head tilted slightly to the side. She was shorter than him, her head reaching just to his chin, but her presence seemed to fill the room. The scent of ozone was replaced by something like crushed lilies and rain. "Master," she said. The word hit Vaxen like a physical blow. Her voice was melodic, echoing with a slight harmonic resonance that vibrated in the air. "No," Vaxen said instantly, stepping back. "Don't call me that. Ever." The girl blinked, her golden eyes shimmering with a faint flicker of confusion. The emerald glow of her skin dimmed slightly, turning to a softer, more muted jade. "I apologize. My prime directive identifies you as Vaxen Kahl, the designated recipient of my life bond. Is my nomenclature incorrect?" "My name is Vaxen, or Vax, just Vax," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. He felt exposed, standing there half-naked and sweaty in his own living room. "And you're Lyra, right?" "I am Lyra," she confirmed. She took a step toward him, her movements silent on the metal floor. She reached out a hand, her slender fingers hovering inches from the scars on his chest. "You are injured. Your biorhythms indicate high levels of cortical stress and long-term physical trauma." Vaxen swatted her hand away, more out of instinct than malice. "I'm fine. It's just old news. Look, Lyra, I don't know what Thraxus told you, but I don't need a companionship unit. I don't need a servant. I'm just a guy trying to live out his days without being bothered. Lyra stood perfectly still, her hands falling to her sides. I am not merely a servant, Vax. I am a Kitharian. I am designed to harmonize with my environment. If you are troubled, I am troubled. If you are in pain, I seek to alleviate it. It is my purpose. Vaxen sighed, walking over to his workbench and grabbing a discarded tank top. He pulled it on, feeling a bit more armored. That's the problem. Purpose. In this sector, when someone says you have a purpose, it usually means they found a way to use you until you break. I don't play that game. He looked at her more closely now. Around her neck was a thin, shimmering band of black metal, a pulse-link collar. It looked like jewelry, but Vaxen knew better. It was a leash. Can you take that off? He asked, pointing at the collar. Lyra touched the metal band. It is part of my integration. It regulates my energy output and ensures my loyalty to the designated bondholder. To remove it without the proper cipher would be detrimental. Detrimental as in it kills you? Detrimental as in it collapses my neural network, she replied matter-of-factly. Vaxen cursed under his breath. Thraxis hadn't sent him a gift. He'd sent him a responsibility. A living, breathing, beautiful responsibility that came with a built-in kill switch. All right, look, Vaxen said, trying to soften his tone. He wasn't good at it. You're here. I can't send you back without the Syndicate making my life a living hell, and I can't throw you out into the snow because you'd freeze in 10 minutes. So you stay here, in the guest alcove. It's small, but it's private. Lyra's eyes brightened. The emerald glow returned to her skin. I accept this arrangement, Vax. How may I begin my integration? Shall I prepare a meal? My database contains over 4,000 culinary profiles from across the mid-rim. Vaxen looked at his empty kitchen counter. I usually just eat protein sliders and drink bitter coffee. Can you handle a slider? I will endeavor to make the most exceptional slider in this quadrant, she said with a small, shy smile. Vaxen watched her move toward the kitchen area. She moved with a strange, hypnotic efficiency, her hands dancing over the basic cooking, heating elements as if she were performing a ritual. He sat down on his bunk, his head in his hands. What have I gotten myself into, he muttered. 20 minutes later, Lyra appeared with a plate. The sliders looked different. They were garnished with strange, colorful herbs she must have found in his emergency spice kit, and the meat was seared to a perfect golden brown. Please, she said, holding the plate out. Eat. Your caloric intake has been insufficient for your muscle mass. Vaxen took a bite. He expected the usual bland, salty taste of reprocessed soy protein. Instead, a burst of flavor hit his tongue. Smoky, spicy, and unexpectedly sweet. Damn, he whispered, taking another bite. This is actually good. What's the catch? Is there some Kitharian mind control drug in here? Lyra tilted her head, a strand of seafoam hair falling over her eye. No drugs, Vax. Only a slight adjustment of the molecular seasoning to stimulate your dopamine receptors. I want you to be happy. Vaxen stopped chewing. He looked up at her, really looking at her. She wasn't just a machine or a pet. There was a depth in those golden eyes, a flicker of something that felt ancient and incredibly lonely. Listen, Lyra, he said, his voice dropping an octave. I appreciate the food. It's the best thing I've eaten since I left the service. But we need to get one thing straight. I'm not your master. I'm not your owner. If you're going to stay here, you're a guest. A partner, maybe. But you think for yourself. You got it? Lyra's skin pulsed with a soft, warm amber light, the color of sunset. To think for myself, that is a complex directive. I have always been told what to be. Then start now, Vaxen said, standing up and taking the plate to the sink. Start by deciding what you want to do tomorrow. Not what you think I want. What you want. Lyra stood in the center of the room, looking around at the cold metallic walls of the prefab. I want... She paused, her voice barely a whisper. I want to see the sky. I have only known the inside of boxes and stations. Vaxen looked at the reinforced window. Outside, the storm was raging, a wall of white and gray. The sky on Corellia isn't much to look at, kid. Just clouds and ice. It is still the sky, she said firmly. Vaxen felt a tug at his heart, a sensation he had buried under layers of cynicism and scar tissue. All right, tomorrow if the wind dies down to under 80 clicks, I'll take you out. We'll go to the observation dome. Lyra's glow intensified until she was the brightest thing in the room. Thank you, Vax. As Vaxen lay in his bunk that night, listening to the soft breathing of the girl in the next room, he realized his life of quiet isolation was over. He had spent years running from his past, trying to be a ghost in the machine. But now he had a light in his house. And lights, as he knew from his time in the infantry, always attracted predators. He reached under his pillow, his fingers brushing the cold metal of his pulse pistol. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had something worth fighting for. Arch-Prelate Thraxus, Vaxen whispered into the dark, you're a son of a bitch. But maybe, just maybe, you knew exactly what I needed. On the other side of the wall, Lyra lay on her small bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She touched the black metal collar around her neck. For the first time in her life, the master hadn't ordered her to serve. He had ordered her to choose. And in the silence of the moon, she chose to trust him. The morning on Corellia did not arrive with a sunrise. It arrived with a scheduled increase in the station's ambient lighting, shifting from the dim violet of the night cycle to a pale, clinical blue that mimicked a frozen, overcast sky. Vaxen Kahl stood by the nutrition processor, nursing a mug of black sludge that the locals charitably called coffee. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the amber glow of Lyra's eyes and the silhouette of that black metal collar. Vax? He turned. Lyra was standing by the entrance to the guest alcove. She had discarded the silver webbing bodysuit for a pair of his old cargo trousers and a thermal gray hoodie. The clothes were far too large for her. The sleeves swallowed her hands and the waist was cinched tight with a length of paracord. Despite the ragged attire, she still looked like a creature made of starlight and silk. Her skin was a soft, contented seafoam green this morning. You look like a refugee from a scrap hauler, Vaxen grunted, though his eyes softened at the sight. But it's better than the tinsel you arrived in. Civvies will help you blend in. A little. Lyra pulled at the oversized hood, covering her pointed ears and the faint shimmer of her hair. Blending in. A tactical necessity, yes? To minimize unwanted observation. Vaxen nodded, tossing her a pair of heavy-duty thermal boots. Something like that. We're heading to the Highline Market, then the observation dome. Keep your head down, don't talk to the scavs, and if anyone asks, you're a mute technician from the lower levels. Don't go flashing that bioluminescence unless you want to end up in a specimen jar. I understand, Vax. I will remain dark, she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that made him want to smile. He hadn't smiled in 2 years. He wasn't about to start now. They stepped out into the main corridor. The outpost was waking up. Thousands of miners, engineers, and deckhands moved through the narrow hallways in a rhythmic, oily tide. The air was thick with the scent of cheap tobacco, ozone, and the metallic tang of the heavy drills. Vaxen walked with a soldier's stride, one hand never far from the concealed holster at his small of back. Lyra walked beside him, her movements hesitant but impossibly smooth. She seemed to glide through the crowd, never bumping into a shoulder, never missing a step. Eyes on your 6, Vaxen muttered as they boarded the maglev lift that would take them to the upper tiers. Corellia is a bucket of crabs. Everyone's trying to climb over someone else to get out. A bucket of crabs, Lyra repeated, her golden eyes wide as she watched a group of rough-looking scavengers arguing over a crate of rusted salvage. A vivid metaphor for a zero-sum social structure. It is unpleasant. Welcome to the galaxy, kid. It's mostly unpleasant. The Highline Market was a sprawling cavern carved into the ice, lit by massive sodium lamps that hung from the ceiling like dying stars. Hundreds of stalls lined the pathways, selling everything from black market med stims to recycled ship parts. Vaxen steered Lyra through the thick of it, feeling the weight of her wonder. She stopped at a stall selling synthetic fruit, her hand reaching out to touch a vibrant purple sphere. Is this a biological entity? She asked, her voice hushed. It's a synth plum, the vendor, a grizzled man with a mechanical eye, barked. 5 credits a kilo, You buying or just dreaming, girl? Vaxen stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the vendor. She's just looking, Pops. Keep your shirt on. The vendor's mechanical eye whirred, focusing on the scars on Vaxen's neck. He grumbled something under his breath and turned back to his ledger. Vaxen pulled Lyra away. Everything here has a price, Lyra. Don't touch unless you're ready to pay, and don't show interest. If they know you want it, the price triples. The economy of desire, Lyra mused. It seems exhausting to constantly mask one's intentions. It's called survival, Vaxen retorted. But as they climbed higher, toward the observation dome, the grid of the market began to fade. The air grew thinner and colder. Finally, they reached the apex of the station, a massive hemisphere of reinforced transparent steel that looked out over the surface of Corellia. Lyra stopped dead. She let the hood of her jacket fall back, forgetting Vaxen's warning. Outside, the moon was a nightmare of beauty. Huge, jagged mountains of blue ice pierced the swirling white mists of the nitrogen storms. Above the horizon, the gas giant around which Corellia orbited hung like a bruised god, its rings casting long, elegant shadows across the frozen plains. The stars were brilliant, unfiltered by an atmosphere, shimmering like diamonds scattered on a floor of obsidian. Lyra's skin flared. A wave of emerald and gold light washed over her, reflecting off the transparent steel. She pressed her hands against the cold surface, her breath hitching in her throat. It is infinite, she whispered. Vax, look, the light. It is calling. Vaxen stood a few paces behind her, leaning against a structural pillar. He didn't look at the sky. He looked at her. In that moment, seeing her bathed in the light of 1,000 suns, he felt a strange, terrifying shift in his own chest. He had spent his life protecting things, supply lines, VIPs, borders. He had never protected a dream. It's just gas and rock, Lyra, he said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. No, she said, turning to him. Her eyes were shimmering with liquid gold. It is connection. Every atom out there is the same as the atoms inside us. We are part of it, Vax. Even here, in this cold place, we are not alone. Vaxen looked away, his jaw tight. I've spent enough time in the black to know it doesn't care about you, kid. It doesn't listen when you scream, and it doesn't mourn when you're KIA. Lyra stepped toward him, the emerald glow of her skin softening into a warm, sunset amber. Is that why you stay in the dark? Because you are afraid the light won't recognize you? Vaxen stiffened. I'm a soldier, Lyra. I don't do poetry. I do results. You are more than a soldier, she said, her voice vibrating with that strange melodic resonance. I can feel the resonance of your soul, Vax. It is like a bell that has been struck too many times. It is cracked, but the note it plays is still true. It is a note of protection. Vaxen wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her to shut up, to get her wires uncrossed, to stop reading him like an open data slate, but the words wouldn't come. He realized he was holding his breath. For the first time in 10 years, he felt seen, not as a weapon, not as a mercenary, but as a man. Come on, he said gruffly, turning toward the exit. We've been out here too long. The patrol droids will be doing their sweep soon. As they walked back through the station, Lyra was quieter, her glow dimmed to a gentle hum. They stopped at a small canteen near the residential tier. Vaxen bought 2 bowls of nutrient broth. They sat in a corner, surrounded by the low chatter of tired workers. Vax? Lyra asked, stirring her broth. On my world, we are taught that we belong to the collective. We are threads in a tapestry. But here, you are all islands. Why? Vaxen leaned back, his eyes scanning the room. Because islands don't sink when the ship goes down. In the rim, if you get too close to someone, you just give the universe a bigger target to hit. It's safer to be alone. But is it better? Vaxen didn't answer. He watched a miner across the room share a piece of bread with a scrawny, 3-legged canine. The miner looked exhausted, covered in soot, but as the dog wagged its tail, the man's face transformed. For a split second, he looked happy. I don't know, Lyra, Vaxen said honestly. I really don't know. They were nearly back to the prefab when a group of 3 men blocked the corridor. They were wearing the heavy, grease-stained jumpsuits of the deep core drillers. The one in the middle, A massive brute with a scar running through his lip stepped forward. He was holding a handheld scanner. "Problem, gentlemen?" Vaxen asked, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that usually made people back off. "Maybe," the scarred man said, his eyes fixed on Lyra. "The scanner's picking up some weird interference, high-frequency bioluminescence. Only a few things in the galaxy put out that kind of signature, and all of them are worth more than a year's worth of ore." Vaxen stepped in front of Lyra, his hand moving to his side. "She's my sister. Genetic abnormality. Now move before I make you part of the deck plating." The men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your sister? Right. And I'm the emperor of the core systems. Move aside, Merc. We just want to see what she's hiding under that hood. If she's what we think she is, the Syndicate will pay a handsome finder's fee." Vaxen didn't hesitate. He moved with the explosive speed of a pre-programmed combat sequence. His fist connected with the scarred man's jaw, the sound of breaking bone echoing in the narrow hall. Before the other two could react, Vaxen had pulled his pulse pistol. He didn't aim for their heads, he aimed for their feet. 2 shots rang out, the blue bolts of energy sizzling against the metal floor. The men jumped back, shouting in alarm. "The next ones go through your knees," Vaxen growled. The barrel of the pistol rocked steady. "Bug out, now!" The men scrambled away, dragging their stunned leader with them. Vaxen didn't relax until they were around the corner. He turned to Lyra, expecting to see her shaking with fear. Instead, she was staring at his hand, the one that had struck the man. Her skin was pulsing with a fierce, protective violet. "You fought for me," she said, her voice a low hum. "I told you," Vaxen said, holstering his weapon and ignoring the throb in his knuckles. "You're under my protection. That means I handle the trash. Now let's get inside. This sector is officially hot." As the door to his prefab slid shut and the locks engaged, Vaxen felt the adrenaline begin to fade, replaced by a cold, nagging dread. He had just made an enemy of a core drilling crew. On Corellia, that was like poking a hornet's nest. But as he looked at Lyra, who was carefully hanging up her oversized jacket, he realized he didn't regret it. He had chosen her. And in this vast, uncaring universe, that choice was the only thing that felt like it mattered. The evening, if one could call the dimming of the station's lights an evening, felt heavy. Vaxen was sitting at his workbench, methodically stripping and cleaning his pulse pistol. The repetitive motion was a form of meditation, a way to quiet the tactical voices in his head that were currently screaming about security breaches and retaliatory strikes. Lyra was sitting on the floor in the center of the room, her legs crossed. She had been quiet since they returned from the market. Her skin was a pale, translucent blue, the color of a deep glacier. She was staring at her hands, her fingers weaving through the air as if she were manipulating invisible strings. "What are you doing?" Vaxen asked, not looking up from his weapon. "I am practicing the deep sync," she replied. "On my world, we can connect with the bioelectrical fields of other living things. We can hear their songs. But here the songs are all discordant. They are full of static." "That's just the station, kid. It's a giant machine. No room for songs in a gearbox." Vaxen reassembled the slide of his pistol with a sharp clack. He set the weapon down and looked at her. Something was wrong. The bioluminescence in her skin wasn't pulsing with its usual rhythm. It was flickering, a jagged, uneven staccato that reminded him of a failing power cell. "Lyra, you okay?" She didn't answer. Her head tilted back, her golden eyes rolling toward the ceiling. A faint, high-pitched whine began to emanate from the black metal collar around her neck. The metal was glowing, not with the soft blue of the crate, but with a harsh, angry red. Vaxen was on his feet in a second. "Lyra, talk to me!" She let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her throat. The collar was constricting, the black metal digging into her mint-green skin. "Vax, it is the core logic. It is breaching." Vaxen grabbed her shoulders, his mind racing. He had seen tech like this before in the Special Ops divisions. It wasn't just a slave collar, it was a failsafe. "Damn it, Thraxis," Vaxen hissed. He hauled Lyra over to his workbench, forcing her to sit in the chair. "Hold still, kid. I need to see the interface." He grabbed a specialized multi-tool and a diagnostic scanner. As he ran the scanner over the collar, the readout screen turned blood red. Warning, logic bomb detected. Neural sync degradation, 40%. Time to termination, 12 minutes. Vaxen felt a cold sweat break out across his brow. A logic bomb. It was a sophisticated piece of malware designed to destroy the host's neural pathways if certain conditions weren't met. Usually it was triggered by an unauthorized attempt to remove the collar or if the host drifted too far from the owner's biometric signature. Why is it triggering now? Vaxen muttered, his fingers flying across the multi-tools keypad. I haven't tried to take it off. The interaction in the hall, Lyra gasped, her skin flickering violently. Your aggression, it spiked my biorhythms. The collar, it interprets high-stress pulses as an escape attempt. It is protecting the asset by destroying it. Vaxen's stomach turned. Protecting the asset? You're a person, Lyra, not a piece of hardware. To the syndicate, there is no difference, she whispered, her golden eyes losing their luster. Vaxen grabbed a pair of fine-point neural calipers. He had to be precise. 1 millimeter in the wrong direction, and he'd bypass the failsafe and trigger the immediate execution command. Listen to me, Lyra. I need you to stay with me. Do that deep sync thing. Try to stabilize your pulse. If your heart rate stays above 140, the bomb will accelerate. I am trying, Vax, but the static, it is so loud. Focus on me, Vaxen barked, his voice cracking. He reached out and grasped her hand with his free one. His palm was rough and calloused. Hers was soft and burning with fever. Focus on the note, kid. The bell. Remember? The note that is true. Find it. Hold on to it. Lyra's fingers tightened around his. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the flickering in her skin slowed. She took a shuddering breath. I hear it. The note of protection. Good, now hold it. Vaxen leaned in, his vision narrowing down to the tiny gap between the collar and her skin. He inserted the calipers, feeling the resistance of the electromagnetic shield. The red light on the collar pulsed faster. 10 minutes to termination. Vax, Lyra said softly, her voice steadying. If you cannot, stop it. You must use the pulse pistol. Do not let the collar finish it. It is a slow death. The neural map burns out one layer at a time. It is agony. Vaxen's hand trembled. Shut up. I'm not shooting you. I don't lose people under my watch. Not again. He bypassed the first layer of the shield. A spark of blue electricity jumped from the collar, stinging his fingers. He ignored it. He was deep into the circuitry now, a labyrinth of gold filigree and crystalline processors. This was Catharian tech, blended with syndicate brutality. It was beautiful and horrific all at once. He found the central processor, a small pulsating crystal at the base of the throat. Around it, 3 tiny needles were poised, ready to inject a neurotoxin directly into her carotid artery. Okay, I see the needles, Vaxen whispered, his breath hitching. I have to retract them simultaneously. If I miss one, the other 2 will fire. The odds of simultaneous retraction without a bypass key are 1 in 8,000, Lyra murmured, her eyes closing. Then it's a good thing I've always had a horseshoe up my ass, Vaxen growled. He adjusted the multi-tool, splitting the output into 3 separate microfrequencies. He had to time it with the pulse of the collar. 3, 2, 1. He clicked the tool. The needles twitched, 1 retracted, 2 stayed. Warning, bypass failure. Injection in 5 minutes. Damn it! Vaxen slammed his hand against the workbench. The collar's red glow was now a solid, angry crimson. Vax, Lyra said, her voice sounding far away. There is another way. The deep sync. If you connect with me, if our biofields overlap, I can use your rhythm to confuse the sensors. But it is dangerous. Your mind, it is not built for the sync. You could be damaged. Vaxen didn't even blink. How do I do it? Press your forehead to mine, she whispered, and let go. Do not fight the light. Let the static in. Vaxen dropped the calipers. He leaned forward, his forehead pressing against hers. Her skin was incredibly hot, radiating a frantic energy. He closed his eyes. Okay, kid, I'm in. Do your thing. Suddenly, the world exploded. Vaxen didn't just see the room, he felt it. He felt the hum of the station's reactor, the distant throb of the mining drills, the scurrying of rats in the ventilation shafts. And then, he felt her. It was an avalanche of sensation. He saw memories that weren't his, forests of glowing trees that reached for a violet sky, the feeling of 1,000 voices singing in perfect harmony, the crushing weight of a cold, metallic box. He felt her loneliness, her fear, and the strange blossoming hope she felt whenever she looked at him. But beneath it all, he felt the logic bomb. It was a black, jagged shard of iron buried in a sea of gold. It was a parasite, feeding on her light. There you are, you bastard, Vaxen thought, his own consciousness merging with the emerald tide of her mind. He didn't use a tool this time. He used his will. He remembered the feeling of holding a perimeter against an impossible tide. He remembered the stubborn, bone-deep refusal to give up. He wrapped that feeling around the black shard, squeezing it, smothering it with his own grit. In the physical world, Vaxen's body began to convulse. Blood trickled from his nose. Lyra's skin flared with a blinding, white-hot light. The collar hummed with a frequency so high it shattered a glass on the nearby table. And then, with a sound like a snapped guitar string, the red light vanished. The black metal collar clicked. It didn't fall off, but the red glow was replaced by a steady neutral green. System stabilized. Logic bomb neutralized. Neural sync restored. Vaxen slumped back, falling off the stool and hitting the floor with a heavy thud. He gasped for air, his lungs burning, his head feeling like it had been put through a trash compactor. Lyra collapsed in the chair, her skin fading to a pale, exhausted mint. She was breathing in deep, ragged gulps. For a long time, neither of them moved. The only sound in the room was the hum of the life support in the distant, indifferent wind of Corellia. Finally, Vaxen pushed himself up into a sitting position. He wiped the blood from his lip, his hands still shaking. Tell me that worked." Lyra opened her eyes. They were gold again, clear and steady. She looked at him with an expression of such profound awe that he had to look away. "It worked, Vax. You entered the sink. You took the static into yourself to save me." She touched her collar. "The bomb is gone. The syndicate, they can no longer kill me from a distance." Vaxen let out a long, shaky breath. "Good, because I am way too old for this kind of cardio." He stood up, his legs feeling like jelly. He walked over to the kitchen and grabbed 2 glasses of water, handing one to her. Their fingers brushed, and for a second, Vaxen felt a faint echo of the sink, a warm, comforting hum that settled in the pit of his stomach. "Vax," Lyra said, her voice soft, "why did you do it? You said islands don't sink together. You could have let the collar fire. You would have been safe." Vaxen leaned against the counter, looking out the small window at the dark, frozen surface of the moon. "I lied, Lyra. Islands do sink. They just sink alone. And I'm tired of being alone." He turned back to her. "Besides, I'm a soldier. We don't leave our people behind. And like it or not, kid, you're one of my people now." Lyra smiled, and this time, it wasn't a programmed response. It was a real human expression of joy. "I like it, Vax. I like it very much." But even as he smiled back, Vaxen noticed something on his diagnostic scanner, something he hadn't seen during the heat of the breach. In the final seconds of the sync, a data packet had been transferred from the collar to his internal comlink. He surreptitiously tapped the display. Encrypted file received. Origin, Catharian Archive. Subject, Project Genesis Key. Vaxen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the moon's temperature. Lyra wasn't just a gift. She wasn't just a comfort maiden. She was a key, and the logic bomb hadn't been there to protect the asset. It had been there to ensure that if the syndicate couldn't have the key, no one could. "Vax," Lyra asked, noticing his change in expression, "is something wrong?" Vaxen closed the display and looked at her, this girl who had seen his soul and still smiled at him. He realized that the 3 miners in the hallway were just the beginning. The whole galaxy was going to come for her. He walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and steady. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," he lied, his voice like iron. But I think it's time we upgraded your training. If you're going to be a part of my crew, you need to know how to handle a pulse rifle." Lyra nodded, her emerald light glowing with a new, fierce determination. "I am ready, Vax. I want to learn." As they stood there in the quiet of the prefab, two islands joined by a bridge of light and blood, Vaxen knew the war was coming, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting for a flag or a paycheck. He was fighting for a family, and that made him the most dangerous man in the sector. The sky above the southern pole of Corellia was no longer a flat expanse of bruised gray. It had become a swirling tapestry of emerald light and warm gold, as if the moon itself were trying to exhale 1,000 years of frozen breath. Below the ridge where Vaxen Kahl had parked the battered skiff, the landscape was changing with a speed that defied every law of xenobiology Vaxen had ever heard of. The permafrost was cracking, and from the deep fissures, thick bioluminescent vines were coiling upward, their leaves broad and translucent like shards of stained glass. Vaxen sat on the edge of the skiff's cargo bed, his boots dangling over the side. His shoulder was a mess of scorched fabric and dried blood, but the pain felt distant, muffled by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. Beside him, Lyra stood as still as a statue, her skin glowing with a steady, rhythmic pulse of seafoam green. She looked less like a runaway asset and more like a goddess surveying her new creation. "It is beautiful, isn't it, Vax?" she asked softly. Her voice lacked the mechanical precision it had possessed 48 hours ago. It was richer now, textured with the same life that was currently terraforming the moon. Vaxen pulled a crumpled cigarette from his pocket, realized he didn't have a lighter, and sighed. "It is a miracle, kid, and in my experience, miracles are usually followed by a heavy orbital bombardment. The Syndicate isn't going to look at this and think, 'Oh, how lovely.' They're going to look at this and see a billion credit loss of control." Lyra turned to him, her golden eyes reflecting the emerald sky. "But the people, Vax, the miners in the outpost, they won't have to breathe recycled air anymore. They won't have to eat soy protein paste. Look." She pointed toward the horizon, where the distant squat silhouette of the Corellia mining outpost sat. Even from this distance, Vaxen could see the change. The thick black smoke of the industrial furnaces was being overtaken by a rising mist of white vapor. The ice around the station was melting into a vast, shallow lake, and the first hints of green were beginning to climb the exterior bulkheads. "They're going to be terrified," Vaxen grunted. "Humans don't handle sudden change well, even if it's a good one. They've spent their whole lives in the dark. You just turned on a sun they didn't ask for." He stood up, wincing as his wounded shoulder protested the movement. "We can't stay here, Lyra. Hrax is likely KIA, but he wasn't the only dog the Syndicate had on the leash. That blast from the Genesis Key was visible from half the sector. Every vulture and bounty hunter within 10 light years is currently adjusting their nav computers to our coordinates." "I cannot leave," Lyra said, her voice turning firm. "The key is still stabilizing. If I move too far from the resonance, the biofabrication will turn chaotic. It could become a cancer instead of a garden. I have to stay until the root system reaches the core." Vaxen looked at her, then back at the skiff. His tactical brain was screaming at him to bug out. He had enough fuel to reach a neutral trade station 3 sectors over. He could disappear again, find a new hole to crawl into, and forget he ever saw a green-skinned girl in a box. That was the smart play. That was the island play. But then he looked at Lyra's hands. They were still stained with the oil from the pulse rifle he had taught her to use. He thought about the way she had looked into his soul during the sync, and found a bell that was cracked but true. "Son of a bitch," he muttered under his breath. "Vax?" "We aren't going to the trade station," Vaxen said, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly tone he used when he was committing to a bad idea. "We're going back to the outpost." Lyra's eyes widened. "Back? But Hrax's men are currently in total disarray," Vaxen finished, jumping down from the skiff. "They're grunts, Lyra. Without a commander, they're just lost souls in a snowstorm that just turned into a rainforest. But the miners, the civilians, they need someone who knows how to set a perimeter. If the Syndicate shows up with a heavy hitter, that station is a tomb unless someone organizes a defense." "You want to help them?" Lyra asked, a small, hopeful smile touching her lips. I want to make sure I don't have to spend the rest of my life wondering if I left 3,000 people to get slagged by an orbital laser, Vaxen said, walking toward the pilot's seat. Now get in the skiff. We've got 20 kilometers of melting ice to cross, and I'd like to do it before the whole moon turns into a swamp. The journey back was a surreal nightmare of shifting geography. Rivers of slush were carving new canyons through the ice, and the air was becoming thick and humid, smelling of damp earth and something sweet, like jasmine. Vaxen pushed the skiff to its limits, the engine whining in protest as they skirted around rising mounds of moss-covered rock. As they approached the main gates of the Corellia outpost, the scene was one of pure chaos. Thousands of workers had flooded out of the airlocks, standing on the thawing ground in their heavy thermal suits. Some were kneeling, touching the soft, wet moss with trembling hands. Others were shouting, arguing, or staring at the green sky with expressions of pure terror. Vaxen brought the skiff to a screeching halt near the main loading docks. He grabbed his combat shotgun and stood up in the bed of the vehicle. "Listen up," he roared, his voice amplified by the skiff's external comms. "Everyone back inside the secondary airlocks. Now!" A few miners turned, recognizing the scarred ex-Marine. "What the hell is happening, Kahl?" one of them shouted. "The air is breathable. The ice is melting. Is this some kind of bioweapon?" "It's a new day," Vaxen shouted back. "But it's a day that's going to bring the Void Chamber Syndicate down on our heads. If you want to live to see the first tree grow on this rock, you need to move. Get the security teams to the armory. Tell them Commander Kahl is taking charge of the defense." "Who gave you the right?" a tall, thin man in an engineer's jumpsuit asked, stepping forward. "Nobody gave it to me," Vaxen said, jumping down and landing with a heavy thud. "I'm taking it because I'm the only one here who's ever fought a syndicate recovery team. Now, do you want to debate the chain of command, or do you want to survive the next 6 hours?" The engineer looked at Vaxen's blood-stained jacket, then at Lyra, who stepped out of the skiff, her skin glowing like a beacon of hope. He nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "I need every pulse welder, every mining charge, and every man who knows how to hold a rifle," Vaxen said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Because the Syndicate doesn't do surrenders. They do erasures." For the next 4 hours, Vaxen worked with a feverish, cold-blooded efficiency. He organized the miners into fire teams, set up defensive nests in the upper observation decks, and used the station's heavy mining lasers as makeshift anti-ship batteries. Lyra stayed by his side, her presence acting as a stabilizing force for the terrified civilians. She spoke to them in her melodic voice, explaining the transformation, calming the children, and helping the medical teams treat the wounded from the earlier skirmish. Vaxen watched her out of the corner of his eye. She wasn't a master and servant anymore. She was a leader. She was the soul of the resistance they were building. "We're spread thin," Vaxen told her as they stood in the station's central command hub, looking at the radar displays. "We've got 300 able-bodied fighters, but most of them are just kids with welding torches. If they send a cruiser, we're FUBAR. Then we must ensure they do not send a cruiser," Lyra said. She was looking at the Genesis key data on the screens. "Vax, the resonance is almost complete. Once it reaches the core, the moon will emit a biomagnetic pulse that will disable any unshielded electronics within 50,000 kilometers. It is a defense mechanism." "How long?" Vaxen asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. 2 hours, maybe less." Vaxen looked at the radar. A single, massive contact had just appeared on the edge of the system. It wasn't a cruiser. It was something worse. "The Void Reaper," Vaxen whispered. "The Archprelate's personal flagship." He turned to the command staff, his face a mask of iron. "Get everyone to the lowest levels. Seal the blast doors. Lyra, you need to go to the core room. If that pulse doesn't fire, we're all dust." "What about you?" she asked, her golden eyes filled with sudden dread. "I'm going to buy you those 2 hours," Vaxen said, checking the power cell on his shotgun. "I'm going to show them that Corellia isn't an island anymore. It's a fortress." He leaned in, and for a brief second, he pressed his forehead against hers, a silent echo of the sync they had shared. "Go," he whispered. "I've got the perimeter." As Lyra disappeared into the elevator, Vaxen turned to the ragtag group of miners standing in the hub. They were scared, tired, and outgunned, But as they looked at the man who had chosen to stand with them, their grips tightened on their tools. "All right, you beautiful bastards," Vaxen growled, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "Let's show the Syndicate how we treat trespassers on our moon." The Void Reaper didn't descend like a ship. It descended like a mountain of black iron, blotting out the emerald sky as it broke through the upper atmosphere. The sheer displacement of air sent a shockwave across the melting plains, snapping the newly formed vines like brittle glass. From its belly, hundreds of dropships detached, screaming toward the outpost like a swarm of angry hornets. Vaxen Kahl stood on the outer rampart of the loading docks, his heavy combat boots planted firmly on the vibrating metal. He had traded his shotgun for a heavy-duty mining laser, a massive, shoulder-mounted beast that hummed with a low-frequency growl. Beside him stood the engineer, Jax, and 20 miners who had refused to go to the lower levels. Eyes on, Vaxen barked over the comms. "Wait for the dropships to hit the transition zone. We only have enough juice for one sustained volley before the capacitors need a reset. Make it count." The first wave of dropships hit the 500-meter mark. "Now!" Vaxen roared. The ramparts erupted in a blinding display of industrial power. The mining lasers, designed to cut through miles of solid rock, tore through the lightly armored dropships like they were made of parchment. Half a dozen vessels vanished in plumes of orange fire, their debris raining down into the new lake surrounding the station. But the Syndicate had numbers. For every ship they knocked down, 3 more landed on the outskirts of the outpost. Armored mercenaries in matte black suits poured out, moving with a disciplined, lethal grace. They didn't use cover. They used mobile energy shields, advancing in a phalanx that the miners' small arms couldn't penetrate. "They're closing the gap," Jax shouted, his face pale behind his visor. "Vax, we can't stop that many." "Keep firing," Vaxen yelled, hosing the advancing line with his laser. "Aim for the shield generators at the base of the phalanx." The air was a chaotic symphony of screaming engines, exploding shells, and the high-pitched whistle of pulse fire. Vaxen felt a searing heat across his thigh as a stray bolt grazed him, but he didn't flinch. He was back in the zone, the cold, tactical clarity of the fringe wars taking over. He wasn't thinking about the pain, or the odds, or the looming shadow of the flagship. He was thinking about the girl in the core room. Deep below the surface, Lyra was kneeling in front of the Genesis key. The chamber was filled with a blinding white light, and the hum of the core was so loud it felt like it was vibrating her very bones. She had her hands pressed against the crystal pedestal, her skin glowing with such intensity that her features were almost lost in the radiance. "Come on," she whispered, her voice lost in the roar of the energy. "Reach the core. Hear the song." She could feel the battle above. She could feel the anger of the mercenaries, the terror of the miners, and the steady, unwavering resonance of Vaxen Kahl. His heart was a drum, beating out a rhythm of defiance that gave her the strength to push through the agony of the sink. The Syndicate's interference was like a wall of static, trying to drown out the moon's heartbeat. But Lyra wove her consciousness through the gaps, pulling the life force of the Genesis key deeper and deeper. Back on the surface, the situation was turning desperate. The mercenaries had breached the outer perimeter and were now fighting floor to floor in the loading docks. Vaxen had been forced back into a narrow corridor, using a pile of fallen crates as a barricade. He was down to his last 2 power cells, and his breath was coming in ragged, bloody gulps. "Kahl!" a voice boomed from the end of the hallway. Vaxen looked up. Standing there was a man he had hoped never to see again. It wasn't Hrax. It was the Archprelate's personal enforcer, a cyborg monstrosity known only as Iron Hand. He stood over 2 meters tall, his body a grotesque fusion of lavender skin and chrome hydraulics. In his right hand, he held a massive vibrating blade that hummed with a lethal frequency. "You were a good soldier once, Kahl," Iron Hand said, his voice a synthesized rasp. "Why throw your life away for a biological tool and a pack of dirt grubbers? Step aside, and I might let you live long enough to see the Syndicate strip this moon bare." Vaxen spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor. "You talk too much, Tin Man, and you've got it backwards. She's not the tool. You are. You're just a screwdriver for a man who's too afraid to do his own killing." Iron Hand roared, a mechanical sound that vibrated the walls in charge. Vaxen met him halfway. He didn't have the strength of the cyborg, but he had the desperation of a man who had finally found something to live for. He dodged a massive swing of the vibrating blade, the air whistling inches from his ear, and drove the butt of his laser rifle into the cyborg's midsection. It was like hitting a bulkhead. Iron Hand backhanded him, sending Vaxen flying across the corridor. He hit the wall with a bone-jarring impact, his vision swimming. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead. "Is this the hero of Nebula Station?" Iron Hand mocked, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. A broken old man dying in a hallway of a third-rate mining colony. How pathetic. He raised his blade for the killing blow. Vaxen looked up, his eyes clear and defiant. He wasn't looking at the blade. He was looking at the ceiling. "Any second now, kid," he whispered. In the core room, Lyra felt the final connection click into place. The resonance hit the center of the moon, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to stand still. "Arise," she thought, her voice echoing through the entire bionetwork of Corellia. The dawn is constant. A massive, invisible wave of biomagnetic energy erupted from the center of the moon. It moved through the rock, through the metal, and through the air with the force of a supernova. On the surface, every piece of Syndicate tech, the dropships, the mobile shields, the pulse rifles, suddenly died. The Void Reaper groaned as its anti-gravity engines failed, the massive ship beginning a slow, agonizing tilt toward the mountains. In the corridor, Iron Hand's blade stopped humming. The lights in his optical sensors flickered and went out. He froze mid-swing, his hydraulic limbs locking up as the surge fried his internal processors. He stood there like a rusted statue, his blade inches from Vaxen's throat. Vaxen let out a long, shuddering breath. He pushed himself up, leaning against the wall for support. He looked at the paralyzed cyborg, then at his own hands. They were still working. The biomagnetic pulse had been tuned to ignore low-tech circuitry and biological life. He reached out and gently pushed Iron Hand over. The massive cyborg hit the floor with a heavy, metallic clang, unable to move a single finger. "Nice try, Bolt Bucket," Vaxen croaked. He stepped over the fallen enforcer and walked to the nearest window. Outside, the Void Reaper was crashing into the ice fields kilometers away, a spectacular display of fire and twisting metal. The remaining mercenaries were being rounded up by the miners, who found themselves holding the only weapons that still worked, their manual welding torches and mining picks. The storm had completely vanished. The sky was a brilliant, shimmering green, and for the first time in the history of the moon, the air was warm. Vaxen made his way down to the core room. The elevator was dead, so he had to take the stairs, his wounded leg dragging with every step. When he finally pushed open the heavy blast doors, he saw Lyra. She was sitting on the floor by the pedestal, her glow dimmed to a soft, tired emerald. She looked exhausted, her hair matted with sweat and her eyes closed. But when she heard the door open, she looked up and smiled. "Vax?" "I'm here, kid," Vaxen said, crossing the room and collapsing on the floor beside her. He didn't care about the blood, or the bruises, or the fact that they were both probably wanted by the entire Syndicate fleet. He just reached out and pulled her into a clumsy, one-armed hug. "We did it," she whispered, burying her face in his shoulder. "The moon is awake." "Yeah," Vaxen said, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." They sat there for a long time, two islands that had finally found their shore. Above them, the miners were beginning the work of building a new world. They were no longer just workers. They were a community. And Vaxen Kahl, the man who had spent his life running from the light, realized he was finally home. The transformation was painful, and the road ahead would be filled with more battles and more hard choices. The Syndicate would return, and the galaxy would not easily accept a living moon. But as Vaxen looked at Lyra, he knew they wouldn't face it alone. They were a family, and a family, as he had finally learned, was the only thing worth fighting for in a cold, dark universe. "I think I'd like to see that tree now," Vaxen said, his eyes closing as exhaustion finally took hold. Lyra squeezed his hand, her warmth seeping into his skin. "Soon, Vax, I promise. The first one is going to be beautiful." And in the quiet of the core room, surrounded by the heartbeat of a world they had saved together, the old soldier finally slept. The silence that followed the biomagnetic pulse was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a new, vibrating stillness. It was the sound of a billion molecules rearranging themselves under the command of a dormant ancient intelligence. On the surface of Corellia, the screaming engines of the Syndicate dropships had been replaced by the soft, rhythmic crackling of ice turning into rushing water. The black, jagged mountains were now veiled in a thick, silver mist that smelled of ozone and ancient rain. Vaxen Kahl lay on the floor of the core room for what felt like hours, though his internal chronometer, now fried by the pulse, couldn't give him the exact count. He felt like a bag of smashed hammers. His shoulder was a burning knot of agony. His ribs felt like they had been put through a trash compactor, and there was a steady, rhythmic throb behind his eyes that matched the heartbeat of the moon. Beside him, Lyra was breathing in slow, deep cycles. Her skin had stabilized into a soft, comforting jade, the violent flares of the battle replaced by a gentle, undulating glow. She looked smaller now, stripped of the terrifying power she had channeled to save the moon. Yet there was a weight to her presence that hadn't been there when she first stepped out of that metal box. "You still with me, kid?" Vaxen croaked, his voice sounding like a rusted gate. Lyra's eyes opened. The swirling liquid gold had settled into a calm, steady amber. "I am here, Vax. The song, it has found its harmony. The moon is no longer screaming." "Good," Vaxen said, gritting his teeth as he pushed himself up into a sitting position. "Because I don't think I have another chorus in me." He looked around the chamber. The crystalline towers were dim now, their energy spent, but the air was rich and warm. He reached out and touched a small, glowing sprout that had pushed its way through a crack in the floor. It was soft, vibrating with a life force that felt alien yet undeniably welcoming. He heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the stairs. He instinctively reached for his pulse pistol, only to remember it was a useless hunk of slag. He settled for tightening his grip on a piece of jagged crystal he'd picked up. The blast doors creaked open, and Jax, the head engineer, stumbled in. He was covered in soot, his thermal suit torn to ribbons, but his eyes were wide with a frantic, joyful light. "Kahl!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "You're alive! We thought, when the pulse hit and everything went dark, we thought you didn't make it." Vaxen let out a short, dry laugh. "Takes more than a little planetary reboot to shake me, Jax." "Sit rep?" The engineer slid down the wall, exhausted. "The Void Reaper is a total loss. Hit the ice fields 5 kilometers north. Most of the dropships are junk. The mercs that survived the crash are surrendering in droves. They don't have any tech that works, and our boys are hunting them down with anything that can swing. But Kahl, the air. Have you smelled the air outside?" "I smelled it," Vaxen said, leaning back against the pedestal. "It's real oxygen," Jax whispered, tears streaking through the grime on his face. "Not that recycled crap that tastes like copper. My daughter, she's outside right now. She's touching the moss. She's 5 years old, Kahl. She's never seen anything that wasn't gray or white. You did this. You and the girl." Vaxen looked at Lyra. She was watching Jax with a look of profound, quiet understanding. "I didn't do it for the air, Jax," Vaxen said quietly. "I did it because this rock needed a reason to stop being a tomb." The aftermath was a blur of frantic activity and quiet realizations. For the next 2 weeks, Vaxen and Lyra moved through the outpost like ghosts of the old world. The transformation of Corellia didn't stop at the surface. The internal heat of the moon had stabilized the station's life support systems, meaning they no longer needed the massive, energy-hungry furnaces that had dominated their lives. But the physical change was only half the story. The miners, once a collection of desperate individuals bound only by a paycheck and a shared misery, were changing too. They were working together, not because a foreman was barking orders, but because they were building something that belonged to them. They were clearing wreckage, planting the seeds Lyra provided from the Genesis Key, and converting the old industrial bays into communal living spaces. Vaxen spent most of his time overseeing the security of the new perimeter. He knew the Syndicate wouldn't just walk away. They would be back with shielded ships and heavier guns. But as he walked the ramparts, he noticed something different. The men and women on watch weren't just looking for enemies. They were looking at the trees. The first actual trees had begun to sprout near the thermal vents. They were tall, elegant things with bark that looked like polished obsidian and leaves that glowed with a soft violet light. Lyra called them soul-reach trees. She said they were the lungs of the moon. Vaxen stood by one of the saplings late one evening, his arm in a sling and his face still mapped with healing bruises. He reached out with his good hand and brushed a leaf. It felt warm, like a living creature. "You're thinking about the next war," a voice said. Vaxen didn't turn. He knew Lyra's resonance by heart now. "Always, kid. It's a hard habit to break." "The syndicate will come," she agreed, stepping up beside him. Her skin was a vibrant, healthy emerald in the moonlight. "But they will find a world that is no longer divided. They will find people who have something worth fighting for. That is a weapon they do not understand." Vaxen looked at her. She had changed so much from the girl in the box. The submissive tilt of her head was gone, replaced by a quiet, regal strength. She wasn't his servant, and she wasn't just his partner. She was the heart of this world. "I used to think that being an island was the only way to survive," Vaxen said, his voice low. "I thought if I didn't care about anything, nothing could hurt me. But looking at this, looking at you, I realized I was just dying slowly in the dark." Lyra reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and steady. "We are not islands, Vax. We are the root system. We hold each other up when the storm comes." Vaxen squeezed her hand. For the first time in 40 years, the weight in his chest, the cold, hard knot of cynicism and grief, began to melt. He realized that his scars weren't just reminders of pain. They were the price of admission for this new life. He looked out over the glowing valley, where the lights of the outpost merged with the bioluminescence of the forest. He saw Jax and his daughter walking along the edge of the new lake. He saw the miners sharing a meal under the violet leaves. He wasn't just a ghost in the machine anymore. He was a man with a home. And as he stood there in the warm breeze of the green dawn, Vaxen Kahl realized that the greatest gift the Baron had ever given him wasn't the girl in the box. It was the choice to love her. 6 months had passed since the day the ice of Corellia turned into a garden. To the rest of the galaxy, the moon was now a legend, a green ghost in the black rim that the Syndicate claimed was a restricted biohazard zone. But for those who lived there, it was the only piece of heaven in 1,000 light years of cold vacuum. Vaxen Kahl stood on the balcony of the new command spire, looking out over the settlement. The old industrial prefab units had been integrated into the living forest, their metal walls now covered in climbing vines that filtered the air and provided natural light. The mining drills had been repurposed into geothermal taps, providing clean, endless energy for the thousands of people who now called this place home. Vaxen was 45 years old, and for the first time in his life, he didn't wake up reaching for a gun. He wore a simple tunic of woven plant fiber, and though his pulse pistol was still tucked into his belt, it felt more like a tool than a lifeline. A loud, joyous shout erupted from the central plaza. Vaxen looked down to see a group of children, human and the few Catharian refugees who had managed to find their way to the moon, playing a game of gravity ball. Among them was Lyra, her seafoam hair flying behind her as she laughed, her skin a brilliant, happy gold. She looked up and saw him, waving a hand in an exuberant greeting. Vaxen felt a tug in his chest, a warm, fierce pride that never failed to catch him off guard. He turned back to the desk behind him. On it sat a small holographic projector. It was a message that had arrived through a back-channel drone 3 days ago. He hit the play button. The flickering image of Archprelate Thraxus appeared. He looked older, his lavender skin now a pale gray, and he was no longer wearing his ornate robes. He was in a simple room, the background suggesting a place of exile or hiding. "Commander Kahl," the hologram said, its voice thin but steady. "I have heard the rumors of the Green Moon. I have heard of the soldier who turned a key into a daughter and a tomb into a garden. The Syndicate is in turmoil. My actions cost them a fortune, and they have stripped me of my titles. But as I sit here in the twilight of my life, I realize that sending Lyra to you was the only truly honorable thing I have ever done." The old alien paused, a ghost of a smile touching his quivering jowls. "You saved my life at Nebula Station, Vaxen. But by choosing to love what I gave you, you saved your own. The debt is settled. Stay hidden. Stay green." The hologram faded into static. Vaxen let out a long breath, a sense of finality settling over him like a warm blanket. The Baron was gone. The syndicate was a distant shadow, and the gift had become the foundation of a new world. Vaxen walked out of the spire and down into the plaza. The air was thick with the scent of blooming soul-reach flowers, a sweet, heavy aroma that felt like a physical embrace. As he moved through the crowd, people nodded to him, not with the fear they'd shown a mercenary, but with the quiet respect they showed a father. He reached the edge of the settlement, where the first tree he had planted with Lyra now stood over 10 meters tall. Its obsidian bark was etched with hundreds of names, the names of those who had fallen during the defense, and the names of the children born since the transformation. Lyra joined him, her breathing slightly elevated from the game. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her warmth seeping into his side. "It is a good harvest, Vax," she said, looking at the tree. "It is," Vaxen agreed. He looked down at his hands. They were still scarred, still calloused from years of war. But as he looked at the green world around him, he realized he didn't want to hide them anymore. These were the hands that had built a home. These were the hands that had held a family together. Vaxen leaned against the cool, vibrating bark of the soul-reach tree and let his eyes drift across the emerald horizon. "For most of my life, I defined myself by what I could destroy. I was a weapon, a specialized tool designed to solve problems with high-velocity slugs and thermal grenades. I thought that was the natural order of things, that the universe was a cold, empty place where you either ate or were eaten. I lived in the silence of my own armor, thinking that every person I met was just another potential target or a temporary ally. I was proud of being an island. I thought the walls I'd built out of cynicism and scars were protecting me. But standing here, in the middle of a forest that shouldn't exist, beside a girl who was supposed to be a possession, I see how wrong I was. The walls didn't protect me. They just made the room smaller until I couldn't breathe. I spent years running from my past, only to find that my future was waiting for me in a box from a man I'd forgotten. I learned that bravery isn't about charging into a fire. It's about having the courage to let someone in when you're terrified of being seen. It's about choosing to stand for something that doesn't have a price tag. Humanity, we aren't defined by our blood or our borders. We are defined by the connections we choose to forge in the dark. We are defined by the people we decide are worth bleeding for. I'm an old soldier, and I've seen enough death to last a dozen lifetimes. But today, as I look at the green sky of Corellia, I realize I've finally learned the only lesson that matters. We aren't here to survive the universe. We're here to make it a little less lonely, one choice at a time. Vaxen looked at the small violet flower growing at the base of the tree. He reached down and picked it, turning it over in his fingers. He felt a deep, resonant peace that he had never known as a soldier. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, casting long, purple shadows across the valley. He thought about the billions of people out there in the cold black, living their lives as islands, afraid to reach out, afraid to be more than what the galaxy told them they were. "I spent 40 years thinking I was alone because the universe was empty," he wondered silently. "But now I have to ask. I spent so much of my life believing that the only way to be safe was to be an island, only to find that the most beautiful things grow when we finally bridge the gap." Looking at your own life, what is the one wall you have built around yourself that you are finally ready to tear down for the sake of someone else? Lyra took the violet flower from his hand and tucked it into the collar of his tunic, her eyes shimmering with a love that was as constant as the dawn. Vaxen smiled, a real, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. He took her hand, and together they walked back toward the lights of the settlement, their footsteps silent on the soft, living earth. He was no longer a ghost in the machine. He was home. The old soldier let out a contented sigh as the first stars appeared, no longer distant and cold, but like old friends watching over a garden that had only just begun to grow.